Winter is such a peaceful time. I love the late second harvests of the cold-tolerant plants and the long shadows thrown by the December sun low in the sky. Good afternoon and welcome to Willow's Green Permaculture. Today it's December 19th, 2 days from the solstice. It's as good a time as any to talk about closing the garden. We still have a few things left in here, some carrots, some kale, some cabbage. I'd like to talk to you about how we prepare our work for the spring so that we don't have to work in the spring when it comes time to plant. How the work we do in the fall to close the garden actually sets the garden up so that there isn't really a whole lot of work to do in the spring to open it again. How do we do that? It's quite simple. So if this is something you're interested in, then let's get started. As the vegetables that we're harvesting, as they finish up, we will remove all the really big pieces, the pieces that aren't gonna, let's say, decompose in one winter season, and we'll put them on our big garden compost pile. Actually, we've got two compost piles on either end of our main garden. There's the other compost pile right over in the corner there, in the lowest section of the garden. Doing some soil building here. Right next to our rain garden and to the pumpkin patch. Put the big pieces there. But all the small pieces of plants and so on, unless they're infested with some kind of bug, we'll just leave them on the surface. And then on top of all of those plants, we will either pile a nice thick layer of leaves or a nice thick layer of compost, and that's usually mushroom compost or compost that we make ourselves here, which we're working on building up more and more every year. But because we're always using it, it's hard to build it up. But with all the forestry work we're doing and calling things out of the forest, invasive species and so on, we're accumulating a lot of compost, and that's good. We pile all that stuff on top of the garden, on top of the soil. So it's going to cover the soil to make sure that there's no erosion during the winter time, and it's going to provide food for the soil life, for the bacteria in the soil, for the fungus in the soil, for the bugs in the soil, and so on. And that's going to increase our soil life, our soil biodiversity, all that microfauna in the soil, which is really good for the plant roots. And all those bugs, the worms, the bacteria, and all the rest of the bugs and the fungus is going to work on all that material. It's going to decompose it so it'll be able to feed the plants. And also, all the work of all the bugs and worms is going to basically turn the soil for us. So in the springtime, where we put the compost, there's nothing to do. We just plant directly in the soil. And usually where I put the compost is going to be in the spots that I'm going to plant early in the spring so that weeds don't, have time to start growing. The areas where I put a nice thick layer of leaves, those are the areas where I'm going to plant later in the spring, because the leaves are going to make sure that as the weather warms up in the spring, but it's not warm enough for things like peppers and tomatoes, eggplant and ground cherries and all the rest of it, as it warms up, well, the weeds aren't going to grow because there's going to be a nice thick layer of leaves. And then the pepper area for next year is all nice and covered up. It's going to stay covered right up until the first week of June. Peppers, garlic, potatoes. And then when it comes time to plant, all I have to do is trace my little rows in amongst the leaves. The leaves will be mostly decomposed anyway, so that thick layer of leaves in the fall will become a very thin layer in the spring. So it'll be real easy to just kind of make rows through it. If I find there's too many leaves in the spring, then I'll just rake them all off the surface and I'll add them to our compost pile, which will be really nice. But one way or another, the soil underneath those leaves and the soil underneath the compost will be nice and ready for the plants, nice and ready for seeds or nice and ready for little plants. And that's it. So there's no turning the soil in the spring. This method is basically what's called no dig, the no dig method. We don't turn our soil. We don't turn it in the fall. We don't turn it in the spring. It saves us a great deal of work. And we will often get the bags of leaves from neighbors who love to rake their leaves. And if those bags they've just got nice leaves in them, then that's perfect. If we open up the bags and we see all sorts of bizarre stuff in there, then we won't use that. But the leaves are perfect for putting in the garden. Sometimes we get some really nice surprises in the leaf bags. Like, for example, 2 or 3 full leaf bags full of white pine needles, which were perfect for mulching our blueberry patch, which has been growing really, really slowly, and so hasn't been competing too well with the surrounding plants. But with these pine needles, they're going to be really happy. And then we also, in one bag, someone threw out a yucca plant. Very few roots. They just tore it out of the ground. But we'll see if it survives. If it's anything like its cousins, the agave in Mexico, these will live. This is our pumpkin patch, which I haven't cleaned up yet. Basically going to take out those large stems, like that big huge mustard stem, other large pieces of plants, and basically cover everything in a very, very thick layer of leaves. If there are any perennial flowers in there, like over there, right there in the middle of the frame, there's some cardinal flower stems. I'm going to make sure not to cover them. And then things like this, these onions, I want them to continue to grow, so I'm not going to cover them up thickly either. Anything that I want to grow, I'm going to cover in a thin layer of leaves. And everything else that I want to integrate into the soil, have it decompose, I'm going to cover in a thick layer of leaves so that it has a rough time growing next year. And then I'm going to plant directly into the leaves next year. It's November 21st. The pumpkin patch is now completely closed. I'm using the sorghum on the outside to hold those leaves in at a thick layer, because it's on the edges that we have the most weed pressure. And so I'm able to pile up the leaves against those sorghum stems to give a nice thick layer. I always pile the leaves on a cloudy day where rain's coming within a few hours, so that the rain can rain down on these leaves, and then that'll hold them in place until the spring. With all that leaf cover, there's a considerable amount of warmth that's going to be added under there that's going to contribute to the decomposition of whatever plants I left in place to get the garden ready for the spring. As you can see, the sorghum stems are really holding the leaves in place on both sides of the stem, really allowing me to build the soil here, because this is the lowest section of our garden. Well, besides the rain garden, that's the lowest section, but this is the lowest food growing section of our gardens out front here. And so it's really important to build the soil here. And these leaves are going to feed the pumpkins, squash, corn, and sorghum that I'll be planting here in the spring. And here's the after image with the piles of mushroom compost put directly on top of the leaves. And this is going to be for our pumpkins for next year. So those leaves are going to feed those pumpkins. All the other leaves that surround those piles are staying in place. Now, the other important thing to remember this time of year is to leave your native perennial flower heads standing all winter. Because what is that going to do? Your native butterflies and your other native bugs that help you, your pollinators, all your native pollinators, they're going to use the stems of those flowers, and they're going to live in them in the winter. They're going to provide them shelter in the winter. The flower heads full of seeds, they're going to feed the birds they're going to feed the little animals. And maybe those little animals, for example, will eat those flower heads, those seeds, wow, those dried seed heads, instead of chewing on the bark at the base of your trees. This is coneflower. You can see the birds are already eating it. See the broken seeds there that they didn't manage to get out, that's stayed there. Others fall to the ground. Virgin's bower stays beautiful all winter. Through the virgin's bower. And gray-headed coneflower gets completely eaten. If you got young trees, it's a good idea to protect the base with a tree protector. Or maybe with a little fence, a little bit of chicken wire, anything like that. However, it's completely normal for animals to browse on young native trees. We grow pawpaw, we grow eastern redbud, we grow tulip trees. All of those, when they were young, they all got nibbled practically right down to the ground their first couple years. And that's fine. What does that do? It basically helps the tree develop a thicker base trunk while it's young, because it stays short. Because the thing is, those animals don't actually kill these plants. They keep growing. Just because they've been nibbled down doesn't mean they're dead, even if they're nibbled right down to the ground, because the root is still alive. Because the thing is, if the action of nibbling these trees down to the ground killed the tree outright, then there'd be no more of these trees left, because that's what these animals do. And so you don't have to worry about it. They'll grow back. Don't pull them out. Don't put something else there. They'll grow back. Another thing you can do to reduce browsing during the winter and all the rest of the year is to plant as many native shrubs and flowers and native herbs and trees and so on as you can that will feed that wildlife. And that way they'll go and eat that stuff rather than eating the stuff in your garden. Because native wildlife prefers the food that it would naturally eat rather than eating the stuff that we cultivate, which is not such natural food for them. Now, if they're starving, or if they don't have any other choices around, well, then that's what they're going to eat. That's why it's so important to encourage your community to develop parks where they've got native pollinator gardens and native wildflower gardens, native fruiting shrub gardens, and so on, native trees, and not just parks with grass. It's very important. That'll help the entire community, and it'll help you in your garden. Because I get a lot of questions about how do we control all that foraging. Well, that's one way. Giving more habitat and more food to the wild animals so that they have what they need. Because eventually nature finds its balance. And the only time there's a real problem is when there's a lack of balance. And one example of a lack of balance is when there's just not enough habitat, just not enough food for those animals. And so then they come into our gardens and they eat. We had the most browsing in our first summer here. After that, well, we still get a little bit every year, especially from raccoons. I find those animals cute and funny, though. They're a nuisance, but they're still cute and funny and really intelligent and very family-oriented. One year, we sent 12 off to the local conservation area, one after the other, day after day. That's a whole story, but I'll tell that another time. As you can see right behind me here, I've already got my mounds set up. I'm pretty sure what I'm going to put in these mounds behind me here next year is cabbage. Cabbage, kale, broccoli. Want to give them a lot more space next year. See how they do. I've got the terrible habit of overcrowding the gardens, and next year I want to experiment with giving way more space than I usually do to some plants to see how they do. If you haven't seen them yet, I'm going to show you some images of some of these plants around here. And some of the leaves and so on. So this was a short video, short but sweet, but important. A way to close your garden that's easy enough to close, because you don't have to turn the soil, you don't have to rip everything out. Just leave most of it, we'll know most of it, what's in there, except for anything that might be problematic, and then just cover everything with compost and leaves. And then there's basically nothing to do in the spring. And then you got fertile and malleable, or what's the word when the soil is nice and loose soil in the spring for your plants. Healthy soil, happy soil, full of happy life, and so your plants are going to be happy too. The roots are just going to have a party with the fungus and with all the other life, and they're just going to do well, and that happiness is going to translate into delicious food for you and your family. Yep. So I hope you liked the video. I think I'm running out of energy here. I hope you liked the video. And if you liked it, don't forget to share it with your friends. Don't forget to hit that like button. And if you haven't done so yet, then subscribe to our channel. Support what we do just by subscribing. Have a wonderful week. Have a great holiday season. Happy New Year. And we will see you next time.